Hello again from southeastern Finland in northern Europe. I continue my series of videos on selected years' historical events, and it's now time for 1964. It was a leap year that is a 366-day year, which according to the Gregorian calendar started on Wednesday. Here's a summary of its events. In January 1964, the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland was dissolved. On January the 5th, 1964, US Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona announced that he would seek the Republican Party's presidential nomination. Pope Paul VI and Patriarch Athenagoras I of Constantinople met in Jerusalem, starting with 36 years of meeting rule, ending in 2000. On January the 8th, 1964, in his first State of the Union address to the US Congress, President Lyndon Johnson, a Democrat, declared a war on poverty. On January the 11th, 1964, the US Surgeon General Luther Terry reported that smoking might be hazardous to one's health. It was the first such statement from the US government. On January the 12th, the predominantly Arab government of Zanzibar was overthrown by African nationalist rebels. A United States Navy destroyer evacuated 61 US citizens. Zanzibar belongs to Tanzania. And then on January the 20th, 1964, Meet the Beatles, the first Beatles album from Capitol Records in the United States, was released 10 days after Chicago's VJ Records released Introducing the Beatles. The two record companies battled it out in court for months, eventually coming to a conclusion. On February the 1st, 1964, the Beatles vaulted to the #1 spot on the US singles charts for the first time with I Want to Hold Your Hand, starting the British invasion in the United States. On February the 4th, 1964, the government of the United States authorized the 24th Amendment to the US Constitution outlawing the poll tax. On February the 7th, 1964, the Beatles arrived from Britain to the New York City's JFK International Airport, receiving a tumultuous reception from a throng of screaming fans, marking the first occurrence of Beatlemania in the United States. On February the 9th, 1964, the Beatles appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, marking their first live performance on US television. Seen by an estimated 73 million viewers, the appearance became the catalyst for the mid-1960s British invasion of American popular music. On March the 4th, 1964, Teamsters president Jimmy Hoffa was convicted by a federal jury of tampering with the federal jury in 1962. On March the 6th, Constantine II became, as it turned out, the last king of Greece upon the death of his father, King Paul. Malcolm X, suspended from the Nation of Islam, said in New York City that he would be forming a black nationalist party. Boxer Cassius Clay, another African-American convert to Islam, announced the change of his name to Muhammad Ali. And on April the 1st, 1964, deployed military rule in Brazil ended the government of democratically elected President Mr. João Goulart. On April the 7th, 1964, IBM announced the system /360. On May the 1st, 1964, at 4 o'clock in the morning, local time, John George Kemeny and Thomas Eugene Kurtz ran the first computer program written in BASIC, or Beginner's All-Purpose Symbolic Instruction Code, an easy-to-learn high-level programming language which they had created. BASIC is eventually, or would be eventually, included on many computers and even some games consoles. On May the 9th, 1964, South Korean President Park Chung-hee reshuffled his cabinet after a series of student demonstrations against his efforts to restore diplomatic and trade relations with Japan. Japan famously and brutally occupied the Korean Peninsula from 1910 to 1945. On May the 28th, 1964, the Charter of the Palestine Liberation Organization was released by the Arab League. On June the 2nd, 1964, Senator Barry Goldwater won the California Republican presidential primary, making him the overwhelming favorite for the Republican presidential nomination. On June the 19th, 1964, the 32-year-old junior U.S. Senator for Massachusetts, Democrat Edward Kennedy, was seriously injured in a private plane crash at Southampton, Massachusetts. The pilot was killed. Although Senator Kennedy survived, he injured his back so badly that he required several months of convalescence, and despite that, he was plagued by chronic back pain for the rest of his life. On July the 2nd, 1964, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 into law, officially abolishing racial segregation in the United States. On July the 6th, Malawi, a country in southern Africa, received its independence from Britain. On July the 8th, US military personnel announced that US casualties in Vietnam had risen to 1,387, including 399 dead and 17 missing in action. On July the 16th, 1964, at the Republican National Convention in San Francisco, Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona, when acknowledging his nomination for President of the United States, declared, "Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice, and moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue." On August the 2nd, 1964, United States destroyer Maddox was attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin. Air support from the carrier USS Ticonderoga sank one gunboat, while the other two left the battle. On August the 7th, with an overwhelming majority, the US Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving President Lyndon Johnson broad war powers to deal with North Vietnamese attacks on US forces. On August the 18th, 1964, the International Olympic Committee banned South Africa from the Tokyo Summer Olympics on the grounds that its teams were racially segregated. On August the 20th, the International Telecommunications Satellite Consortium, or Intelsat, began to work. At the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City, New Jersey, from August the 24th to 27th, 1964, incumbent President Lyndon Johnson was nominated for a full term, and a well-known liberal and progressive Democrat, U.S. Senator Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota, was nominated for vice president. On August the 27th, Walt Disney's Mary Poppins had its world premiere in Los Angeles. It would go on to become Disney's biggest moneymaker and winner of 5 Academy Awards, including a Best Actress. It was the first Disney film to be nominated for Best Picture. From August the 28th to 30th, in the Philadelphia race riot, tensions between African American residents and police led to 341 injuries and 774 arrests. On September the 14th, 1964, in Rome, the third period of the Second Vatican Council opened. Or I should have said more specifically, in the Vatican. From October the 10th to 24th, 1964, the 1964 Summer Olympics were held in Tokyo, Japan, the first Olympic Games to be held in an Asian country. Since then, the following Summer Olympics have been held in Asia. The 1988 Summer Olympics were held in Seoul, South Korea. And then the 2008 Summer Olympics were held in Beijing, China. The upcoming 2020 Summer Olympics will also be held in Tokyo, besides the 2018 Winter Olympics were held in Pyeongchang, South Korea. On October the 12th, 1964, the Soviet Union launched Voskhod 1 into Earth orbit as the first spacecraft with a multi-person crew and the first flight without spacesuits. The flight was cut short and landed again on October the 13th after 16 orbits. On October the 14th, 1964, American civil rights movement leader Martin Luther King Jr. became the youngest recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize, which was awarded to him for leading nonviolent resistance to end racial prejudice in the United States. To scroll up, because earlier in okay, yes, it was in August, had been in August 1963 when he had famously and extemporaneously delivered the "I Have a Dream" speech in Washington, D.C. I'll just check this detail and then go on. Go on with this video. Sorry for the wait. Yes, on August the 28th, 1963, he had delivered that famous speech about his dream that one day there would be no more racial segregation or prejudice in the United States. On October the 14th and 15th, 1964, a radical change occurred at the political top of the Soviet Union. For over 11 years, Nikita Khrushchev had been the virtual Soviet dictator, although his power had not been even nearly as brutal as that of his predecessor, Joseph Stalin. He was deposed as leader of the Soviet Union. Officially, the reasons were given as his advanced age. Mr. Khrushchev was 70 years old at the time, and his declining health. Leonid Brezhnev became the first general secretary of the Soviet Communist Party. Alexei Kosygin became the Soviet prime minister, and then Nikolai Podgorny became the Soviet president. At that time, it was simply the supreme chairmanship of the Soviet parliament. On October the 15th, 1964, the British Labour Party narrowly defeated the ruling Conservatives and received a 4-seat overall majority in the House of Commons. Harold Wilson became the new Prime Minister. On November the 3rd, 1964, the incumbent US President and Democratic presidential candidate Lyndon Johnson defeated his Republican opponent, Senator Barry Goldwater, by a landslide with about 61% of the popular vote, winning 44 states out of 50. In the simultaneously held congressional elections, the Democrats also were far more popular than the Republicans, winning 2/3 majorities, or actual majorities of over 2/3 sorry, in both the US House of Representatives and the US Senate. And in the simultaneously held state and local elections, they were also prevalent, but Johnson already suspected, or already said in a speech some months later, that he probably had already lost 2 or 3 million votes out of his 16 million majority. On November the 9th, 1964, the British House of Commons voted to abolish the death penalty for murder in Britain. The death penalty had, except in the wartime and in cases involving armed officers or army officers, being executed by hanging. On December the 1st, 1964, Gustavo Diaz Ordaz took office as president of Mexico, another president of the center-left Institutional Revolutionary Party. On December the 11th, 1964, the Cuban-born communist leader, or communist guerrilla leader, Che Guevara addressed the United Nations General Assembly. A bazooka attack was launched at the headquarters of the United Nations in New York. On December the 12th, or Jamhuri Day, Kenya in East Africa became a republic with Mr. Jomo Kenyatta as its first president. On December the 22nd, 1964, a cyclone in the Palk Strait destroyed the Indian town of Dhanushkodi, killing 1,800 people. The United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, or UNCTAD, was established on December the 30th, 1964, as a permanent organ of the UN General Assembly.